I'm here with Louis Head from DLA Piper. Just to introduce myself and why I'm credible to be asking these questions of Louis. I'm Doug Liddle. I currently chair UKSpace, the trade body, but I'm also an investor in space businesses. And recently, I exited my own space business, having sold it to BAE Systems. As I say, I'm here with Louis Head. Louis has just delivered the unit on strengthening leadership and governance. And I've got a couple of, hopefully quite difficult questions for him now. So, Louis, if you want to quickly introduce yourself, and then I'll get into some questions.
Thanks so much, Doug. Yes, looking forward to those questions. Louis Head, I'm a senior lawyer at DLA Piper. My practice focuses on complex major projects and procurements. And part of that practice is focused on advising on the full life cycle of space missions, with a focus, I suppose, from my perspective, on contractual regulatory aspects. But I work with a global team to advise on those missions fully through the life cycle. Thanks, Doug.
No worries. Thanks, Louis. And so you really do see the full spectrum of businesses coming through the doors at DLA Piper.
We do.
And just thinking, I mean, looking through that legal risk lens that the way you see the world, I guess, how can space businesses better ensure that they are able to grow sustainably and to make themselves more investable as they mature?
Yeah, thanks, Doug. That is a bit of a challenging question, actually, but I suppose as space businesses mature, it's really important that they consider legal, regulatory, risk requirements and general compliance on an ongoing basis. And whilst that's generally important to ensure compliance and mitigate potential exposure, it's also important for if and when businesses are looking for investment. And that's because investors will, for example, want to carry out a level of due diligence in advance of investing. More broadly, I suppose, and focusing more on risk. It's really important at an early stage that space companies consider how risks and resulting liabilities are ultimately allocated, and how such risks and resulting liabilities can otherwise be addressed or mitigated. And then what this will do is essentially reduce the likelihood of exposure down the track in the event that, although it might be unlikely, in the event that such certain risks come to fruition. And this is particularly important in the space sector, given the potential for liability and the nature of that potential exposure. And I suppose what you might say, well, Louis, what are you talking about specifically there? And I think what I'm thinking about first off, for example, is the drafting of your standard terms and conditions and contractual arrangements. How do you allocate risk in those arrangements? And also, how do you kind of potentially ultimately back off risk? For example, perhaps considering how your insurance policies work, for example, is another kind of practical example that comes to mind.
Okay. And to be honest, I recall when I was exiting my company, we ended up generating about 400 documents into our data room, and a big chunk of those were around the commercials and understanding how did we contract, where were our liabilities, etc. I guess it'd be interesting to understand from your perspective, what due diligence would you expect to see the investors carrying out, and where are they really going to dig in advance of investing in a space business?
Yeah, thanks, Doug. And I think so potential investors will, in all likelihood, want to carry out detailed due diligence in advance of investing. And what does that mean? It means that they're likely to want to review key contracts. They're going to want to have a look at your licensing, regulatory status, the status of IP rights, potential risks and exposure to liabilities, which kind of dovetails well with that previous question, and general records, recording that the business is operating in a compliant way. I think, I suppose one caveat to that is the extent and the nature of the due diligence will depend, of course, on the type of investor that's looking to invest, and also will depend on the type, size, and nature of the investment that's going in. So, I mean, one main message, I suppose, is as you continue to build, your space business, it's really important that you bear that in mind, and you continue to build with those points in mind, because that is what will help unlock investment and reduce the likelihood, I suppose, of issues or delays when it comes to raising investment. Preparation and ensuring policies, procedures, processes are in place are also is key, to making sure that you have all of that information to hand and that you're operating in a compliant way. But ignoring, I suppose, if the flip side of that is ignoring regulatory requirements, failing to document compliance and failing to put in place processes, could affect, for example, whether investors may choose to ultimately invest, and may affect the kind of investability of your space business. And I suppose that kind of leads me to saying that, especially as businesses, space businesses mature, it's really important that you consider taking kind of specialist independent legal advice at an early stage, particularly if you're preparing, for this kind of very formal process of seeking investment.
Yeah, incredibly wise words, Louis. I guess sort of shifting slightly the focus of the questions,
Yes.
Intellectual property, so IP. It provides a massive competitive advantage for a lot of businesses, especially these growing businesses who have gone through the startup. They've started to develop product lines and markets, etc. And the IP provides that defensive moat against other businesses that might be intruding on your patch. With regards to investability, what should businesses do around protecting their IP?
Thanks, Doug. I think this is super important, as you say, because it's in that intellectual property, the intellectual property rights that attach to that is essentially the value or a lot of the value of the business. And it's so important that, in order to maintain your investability, that IP is protected, given that it's that know-how, those solutions that have been created or will be created that you're ultimately selling. And in terms of, I suppose, there are a number of initial steps I would suggest, that space businesses consider it first off, and I think that goes right back to basics, including kind of making sure that, you've got relevant, that there are clearance searches that have been undertaken to make sure that your chosen name and logo isn't being used by someone else, that you've registered your trademark and your brand, that you've registered your domain name, that you've ensured that you own the IP that you're using and you don't need a license to use a third party's IP, and that you don't inadvertently or on purpose disclose any IP without putting in place appropriate protections, for example, using a non-disclosure agreement. So those are kind of just some initial points that should be considered. But as you say, Doug, I think once you've got through those, it's more, thinking seriously about how you protect your company's IP to make sure that it can't be replicated, and to make sure that you're not at risk of potentially infringing others' IP. And what we've done is sort of alongside this video, there should be a key legal considerations checklist relating to IP, which should be is available, and that should provide sort of further useful information and initial steps that should be useful for space businesses.
Great, thanks. That sounds incredibly useful. I wish we'd had that when we were selling our business. I guess finally, kind of a mop-up question really would be, is there anything you've not talked about when you say, what would a business consider when it's planning to raise equity investment? We've touched on some of the key areas around regulation, IP. Anything else we've missed?
I think, the key part here is, and I think sometimes this is not kind of thought about at an early stage by a number of space businesses, particularly as they're looking to scale, but there are legislative requirements relating to the raising of equity finance, which space companies should consider at an early stage, well in advance of seeking investment. And I suppose this sort of also dovetails well because we've got another useful checklist that should be published alongside this video, which provides a kind of key legal considerations checklist for raising equity finance. And what that does is set out some preliminary preparatory steps that should be taken in advance of seeking that investment. But it also provides an overview of those legislative requirements, for example, in relation to offers to the public, financial promotions, and liability around misleading statements. But I think that would be a useful starting point, Doug, in addition to some of the other points that we've discussed for space businesses looking for equity investment.
Sounds like another excellent resource, Louis. Thanks a lot. So thanks a lot for your time, and yes, enjoy the rest of your day. Thanks, Louis.
Thanks so much, Doug.